All right, there was an objection during closing argument. It's a perfect time to bring in my wonderful guest, Law and Crime legal analyst, Jonna Spilbor. Let me bring you in because typically, you don't see attorneys object during closing. Tell our viewers why might be reasons that they do object.
All right. So in order to object, you have to commit a serious enough offense during a closing argument, Ashley, such as trying to bring in evidence that actually was not admitted during the trial, for example, or what this prosecutor seems to be doing is making a comment on the defendant's or actually one of the victim's rights to say or not say something. So she's trying to bring in something that perhaps is not before the jury, and that is a legitimate reason to have a sidebar during closing argument.
And let me say this, she is up there, and you can tell she is textbook because she's speaking to the jury. She's walking around. She's not reading notes. There have only been 2 objections, and she is going over every meticulous little piece of testimony. I think to only have gotten 2 objections at this point, to arguably only get 2 words wrong at this point is pretty impressive. Jonna Spilbor still with us, thankfully. Tell me, first of all, your overall opinion after you've watched that closing argument.
Ashley, same as yours. That was one of the finest closing arguments I ever had the pleasure, for lack of a better word. Now, we got to remember, we're dealing with a dead child here, so I don't want to minimize that. But in terms of the skill with which this prosecutor presented and summed up the evidence of this trial to the jury was really nothing short of magnificent. And she did it without histrionics. She had a little bulletin board with pieces of paper that she was pulling off, but it was spot on.
I agree. And what's really hard, I think, sometimes for all of us who have been trial attorneys is to remember, and I teach trial skills all over the nation, when you make a closing argument, you don't want to be tied to your notes, tied to a podium. She did textbook. She was out front. She was speaking. She was connecting with the jury. I mean, to me, it was just an outstanding display of what you want to do when you make a closing argument.
And you know what else she did, Ashley? She made it easy for this jury to do what she wants, and that is to find this defendant guilty on all of the counts. Now, we know because she went through them like every prosecutor does. You go from really the lowest impact charges to the highest impact charge, which in this case is murder. She walked them through. She basically undercut the defendant's entire defense. She wasn't lying to police then. She's basically lying now. And that's the moral of the story for this prosecutor.
Good. So let's break down some of the closing argument. And she did at one point talk about, listen, you're going to hear about reasonable doubt. You have to determine if there's reasonable doubt or not. She gave the definition. You have to decide, jurors, what's reasonable. Use a common sense conclusions based on the evidence presented. So, Jonna, here's what I want you to talk about. She went through 3 explanations: the gravel driveway, falling off the train, and Jason, the father, was somehow involved. And in going through those, she said, listen, none of these things provide a reasonable explanation. Do you agree or disagree with her?
I completely agree with her. And what she did was very well done, because you have to remember, the jury hears the entire trial over a course of days, sometimes weeks, right? And the theory of primacy and recency can come into play. So the most recent thing they hear can sort of take precedence over stuff that they heard long ago in this trial. And what this prosecutor did was basically say, look at the evidence and then compare it to this defendant's story, and you will see that they do not jive. And if they do not jive, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have to rely on the evidence itself. I thought it was wonderful.
Me too. So the defendant, let's talk about the defendant during this entire closing. At one point, I thought she looked like she was smiling, but someone here pointed out to me her eyes have been rolling a lot. The jury gets to see her. What do you think of eye rolling during closing argument? Does that affect the jury's decision or not?
I can't think of any sort of, I don't care if you're on trial for jaywalking. I don't think a defendant eye rolling is going to help that defendant's case. And certainly when we are dealing with a dead 3-year-old, oh my goodness, no, she should not be, oh look, they're showing clips now. She should not be rolling her eyes or looking disgusted. She should be, at this point, Ashley, scared.
Right. And that's the thing that I noticed, too. I don't feel like she is scared. I think, to me, she's like, oh, whatever. I don't really care. Did it or not, whatever. So the other thing that I really have to point out, too, is this prosecutor, I thought, and I want to get your opinion, she also, in a pleasant way, sounded like the defendant when she was reciting testimony or things that the defendant said during her police questioning. So I thought it was really effective.
I think it's brilliant. She really, with that affect, she's getting in the minds of these jurors because they listened to her just like everybody else in the courtroom did, right? And she is saying without saying why the jury should not believe this defendant. She's got this look of incredulity on her. She's basically saying, look, this is how you know she was lying, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, and she put on this affect. I thought it was very well done.
So one last question. We're going to have to take a break very shortly, but motive. She talked about we do not have to prove the motive behind this or the mechanism, so exactly how she caused that injury. Does that affect a jury? Not knowing those things, are they inclined to not want to say the person's guilty?
In my opinion, normally a jury wants to know the motive, even though it's not an element of the offense. What she did here is even better than that. She didn't just say, we don't have to prove motive, so we're not going to. She compared the, quote, motive of the defendant to the motive of this child's father. Like, wait a minute. She wanted to sell you a story, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, that this father was motivated to harm his child. Well, look at all the things the defendant was going through in the day or two before this incident happened. She had motive as well. So she basically canceled out part of the defense in doing that. Again, a great strategy.
So this prosecutor is saying, listen, it doesn't make sense for her to say I'm protecting everybody when look at the two individuals, Jason, her husband, Jason, the father of Hannah, and her husband, TJ, aren't worth much, really, is my interpretation. Jonna, let me bring you back in. How compelling did you think that piece was?
I thought it was very compelling. There wasn't really a piece of this closing argument that was not compelling. If the jury were tasked with coming back with a verdict right now without listening to the defense closing argument, of course, that would never happen. But if they were, this prosecutor really sewed up reasonable doubt. In other words, there isn't any. So I'm very curious to see how the defense is going to handle that, Ashley, because you're a judge. You can't create reasonable doubt at trial. In other words, you can't put your client on the stand to say, all right, now tell everybody that you lied through this whole investigation, and that'll be our reasonable doubt. And it feels like that's what the defense tried to do here.
And one of the things I'm going to want to talk to you about a little bit later this morning is, did the defense maybe have more reasonable doubt before she testified? And then once she testified, she sealed her fate. So this closing argument is all about, listen, they made the evidence fit this defendant versus following the evidence. Jonna Spilbor, I know you're going to be signing off, but quickly tell me, what do you think of her closing argument?
Two thoughts. Number one, it is very clear where she's going with this. She's trying to create reasonable doubt by saying to the jury, if you think there's the slightest possibility that Jason Weshy is responsible for his daughter's death, you have to find my client not guilty. Here's the problem, Ashley. She's now created the battle of the liar, not the battle of the expert. She's claiming Jason Weshy was a liar, but her whole defense is based on her client being a liar. Now we have the battle of the liars. What is the jury going to do with this? Both of these attorneys did a good job, I must say.
Right. I completely agree with you. I think both of their arguments are compelling. The one thing, boy, she started out strong. She said when she started in her closing argument, hey, why don't we look at 33,000 pages text phone information from Jason's phone? The state never looked at his phone. They never interviewed him. They never brought him to the police station on 2 different occasions. Would that have made a difference? Give me an answer in 2 seconds.
Probably not. And look, she had time to hire an investigator. I got investigators on speed dial. She was working up this case.